What's up guys, my name is Diachronicos here on this Destiny 2 video, and today we're going to be talking about the top 5 PvE heavy guns in Destiny 2 right now. Now this countdown is based on a bunch of different criteria. First off, it's based on the DPS that I performed in the Last Wish raid, the first encounter known as Kali at 650 power. I basically did this over and over and over again, shooting the boss in many different ways with many different weapons, and I tabulated the results to get an accurate damage per second, and on top of that show off the possible total damage you can do to Kali with a full ammo on that weapon. And the last criteria is going to be ease of use. How easy is it to use against many different enemies at many different ranges, as well as how safe is it to use that weapon. For example, swords are a little bit less safe, so they're going to be lower down the list. Make sure you stay to the end if you want to see the full list of the weapons that I tested for DPS. If you want to see all the numbers possible, of course, everything will be there at the end, so make sure you stay tuned for the whole video if you want to see the entire list. Today's video has been brought to you by cute and adorable puppies. I gotta say, one of the best parts of my days is going on Google and typing in cute, fluffy, adorable puppies and just looking at an entire list, and every 3 seconds just going, "Aww." It's a very satisfying thing to do in my job, and I love it, and I'm so glad that you guys love it as well. Anyways, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the top 5. Starting at number 5 in this top 5 countdown is going to be the Hammerhead Legendary Heavy Machine Gun. Now this weapon is amazing in so many different ways, and I highly recommend you take a look at this weapon because it is definitely something you should use. First of all, this weapon can be obtained from the Black Army Forge quest. Just follow the machine gun frames from Ada whenever she has them that particular week to forge this weapon. Now this weapon is versatile in so many different ways. Firstly, it is easy to use at any range because it is a machine gun. If you do miss, it's not really that much of an impact. Just get back on target and keep firing. It can be used against bosses, it can be used against elites, and even fodder with good efficacy. It's also a legendary weapon, so it can be used with other exotics in the other 2 slots. And on top of that, this weapon deals void damage, which is rare to find a good void damage weapon because it is much more of a solar dominated PvE arena these days with things like Ikelos, which was a worm, sleeper simulant, and a lot of these solar supers are just dominant in PvE, so to find a nice void damage weapon is really nice. And lastly, this weapon has a chance of getting good random rolls. Lots of different possibilities in the forge. Every single time you make it, you have an opportunity to get a random roll. And the last thing to mention about this weapon is going to be its DPS test. Now its DPS is the lowest in this entire list at 54,000 damage per second, which is still a pretty decent DPS when compared to pretty much every other gun in the game outside of this list. But what makes this weapon so very amazing is going to be its total ammo damage. At 240 rounds, it is the highest amount of ammo in any heavy machine gun and has a good potential for some pretty incredible amounts of total ammo damage. Next up, coming up in number 4 in this top 5 countdown, is the exotic sniper rifle known as Darcy. Now this weapon is definitely one of those underrated weapons that I highly recommend you take another look at. First of all, this weapon can be obtained from a random exotic engram from the core game. And what makes this weapon so very amazing is it has a special perk that gives 4 times the damage if target is highlighted by personal assistant perk. Now the personal assistant perk is pretty simple. Just aim at the target for less than a second, they'll highlight in red, and that means you're good to go to do 4 times the damage, which is insane. Now you need to take this with a grain of salt. It is a high fire rate sniper rifle, meaning it is more difficult to use. Missing shots is going to be a lot more common, and the fact that it is a higher fire rate means achieving the top DPS, which is the best DPS in the entire game, is this weapon right here, is going to be a little difficult because firing at the maximum fire rate is going to be a little difficult because you'll just be flying off target every time. Now I highly recommend you get the catalyst for this weapon. If you do get it, it helps increase the stability, making it so it can keep your target without losing personal assistant. As for the DPS test, this weapon, again, the highest DPS in the game at 131,000 damage per second and a pretty decent total damage at 1.3 million. However, it is probably the smallest amount of total damage in this entire list of weapons. Coming up at number 3 in this top 5 countdown is going to be the exotic heavy machine gun known as Underlord. Now this weapon is incredible in so many different ways. Now firstly, it can be obtained in a random exotic engram from Forsaken. Used to have an exotic quest line, but that has been reverted into the exotic engrams. What makes this so amazing, on top of the fact that it is a heavy machine gun, is it has a very nice set of perks. First of all, it fires faster the longer you hold the trigger down for an incredible amount of extra DPS, and secondly, lightning explosions on kill. So if you do end up killing enemies with this weapon, because again, it is a heavy machine gun, so it can be used on bosses, elites, and fodder, any enemy that you kill with it has a chance to just explode in arc damage, which is very effective at killing lots of little fodder enemies. And on top of that, again, it is a heavy machine gun, so it's easy to use at pretty much any range in any situation. And lastly, let's talk about its DPS test. At 74,000 DPS, it has a much higher DPS than the 54,000 of the Hammerhead, with a 1.5 million total damage, has a little bit less ammo than the Hammerhead itself, so it's going to have a lower total damage. However, you could make up with that damage for the lightning explosions from getting kills, on top of the fact that it just has so much better DPS than the Hammerhead itself. I would highly recommend this weapon over the Hammerhead if you have the option. Coming up at number 2 in this top 5 countdown is going to be the exotic linear fusion rifle known as Sleeper Simulant, and I gotta say this is one of my most favorite weapons from this game. I don't even care if most favorite is even grammatically correct. It is one of my most favorite weapons from this game right now, because it is such a powerhouse at everything that it does. It dominates in PvP, it dominates in PvE for damage and DPS, and it used to dominate, and it still kind of dominates in Gambit for both the PvP and PvE aspect. This weapon is fantastic, and I highly recommend you get it. Now, this weapon can be obtained from a Sleeper Simulant exotic quest line from the Warmind DLC, so if you want to get it, it's a bit of a lengthy one, but highly worth it. What makes it so very amazing is that it is a high damage, high critical hit linear fusion rifle, on top of the fact that it is very versatile. First of all, it is a very high aim assistance to give you easier headshots, or even just easier hits in general. Pretty much not aiming at the target, you'll still hit the target, which is pretty insane. And it's also capable of very long range engagements, which is very useful in things like Gambit. And lastly, the catalyst is actually somewhat amazing. It actually increases the fire rate. Well, technically it lowers the charge time, which would increase the total fire rate. To get this catalyst, you have to complete the Spire of Stars Prestige raid. Every encounter has a chance of dropping this catalyst. And the very last thing about this weapon, let's talk about the DPS test that I performed. First of all, 81,000 damage per second, which is actually without the catalyst, I might add, and 1.7 million total damage. You can imagine 1.7 million, pretty much one of the highest in the entire game, and the fact that 81,000 is pretty much some of the highest DPS in the entire game. It is some pretty impressive damage and DPS. This weapon is insane. I can't even imagine what it's going to be like with the catalyst. And finally, coming up at number 1 in this top 5 countdown is the exotic sniper rifle known as Whisper of the Worm. Now, this is not a controversial pick. Pretty much everybody in the game knows that Whisper of the Worm is the PvE powerhouse, but this weapon is amazing for so many different reasons that I have to include it as number 1. First of all, this weapon can be obtained from the Whispers of the Worm exotic quest line that released right before Forsaken, pretty much every weekend on IO. Look up a video online, it's pretty straightforward. Now, what makes this weapon so very amazing is, first of all, extremely high damage and high critical hit multiplier. Secondly, it's pretty much the highest total damage potential with its infinite ammo perks, and it has an incredible set of perks for what it needs to do. First of all, the White Nail perk helps you get infinite ammo from landing 3 precision headshots in quick succession, which gives you 3 ammo back into the magazine, pretty much free ammo, not from reserves, allowing you to literally have a chance of getting infinite ammo. On top of that, the Whispered Breathing perk, which allows for extra box breathing damage. Just aim down sights without firing and without leaving sights for around 2 seconds. You get a buff from the bottom left, and you do increased critical hit damage multiplier until you leave your sights, or you miss. And on top of that, the Catalyst from the same Whisper of the Worm exotic quest line, which again, looking up online, will give you extra whispered breathing damage, which is insane. Pretty much the only downside about this weapon is it is a sniper rifle with a lower fire rate, and it is a lot more difficult to use sniper rifles, especially with the long range zoom on it. You're gonna find yourself missing those headshots that you think you can get every time. As far as the DPS on this weapon, it has some of the highest DPS in the game at 108,000 DPS compared to the 130 of the Darcy, and 2.02 million total damage. And that is without getting any White Nail proc, without getting any free ammo. This weapon has unlimited potential, and I would say if you would hit White Nail pretty much half the time, you'd get around 3 million total damage with the total ammo, which is insane. Which, by the way, is pretty much more ammo or more damage you'll need as a single person for any boss in any raid ever. Anyways, that's pretty much my top 5 for you guys today. Let me know in the comments down below what your top 5 are. I want to hear about weapons that I haven't considered yet. On screen now is my full DPS test for you guys, so you can see all the different numbers. In the description down below, you can find the link to the docs if you want to see all the notes, the little black triangles in the corner there. Those are all my notes in case there's extra things you wanted to learn about it, as well as the fact if I ever do update this list, they will be over there for you. Now let's go ahead and talk about honorable mentions. Let's start off with the Anarchy, pretty much the lowest DPS in the game, but actually had the highest total ammo damage of 3.1 million damage. Now technically the Whisper of the Worm will most likely have more total damage than that because of the fact that you can actually get infinite ammo. However, I would say that it's actually a pretty interesting prospect. Now the way I found to do the most damage most efficiently is tag the target with 2 grenades, let those shockies go off until they explode, and then tag them again with the next 2 grenades. While those 2 grenades are shocking the target, you can switch over to an energy or a kinetic weapon and start dumping damage with those weapons. Now again, this weapon does not do incredible amounts of DPS, however, it could be considered pretty much free damage while you're using your secondary. Now to give you an example, just tag the target with 2 grenades from Anarchy, switch over to your Ikelos, and start dumping damage with Ikelos, which I also have on my DPS spreadsheet to give you a comparison to how good that weapon is. Now if you take in consideration the Ikelos does around 100,000 damage without Trench Barrel just unloading into a target with the Rally Barricade, and you combine that with the 17,000 damage that the Anarch can do at the exact same time, compare that 117,000 damage to the Whisper's 108,000 damage per second. Now technically you can get higher, however you're going to run out with Ikelos way before you run out with the Anarchy, so it's not really that worth it. Next up on the honorable mentions, pretty much any linear fusion rifle in the legendary shot like Dead Ender, Crooked Fang, these are all fantastic weapons, especially Crooked Fang with the potential of having box breathing is actually some pretty impressive DPS and pretty impressive total damage, so I highly recommend you check that out. Secondly, I also wanted to talk about the sword, the Striker's Sure Hand. I actually was able to get one with Surrounded, and it actually did some pretty impressive amounts of damage, and I highly recommend if you do want to use a sword, go for the new Striker's Sure Hand, because again, it has a chance of a random roll of giving you Surrounded and some other perks that help with your damage. And the last thing I wanted to mention is going to be some Void rocket launchers that seem to have some incredible efficacy against Riven and large bosses, similar to the way we use it against Argos and sometimes even on Callus. However, I would say pretty much anybody else in the game, you're not going to do pretty much any damage at all. It had the lowest damage out of everything in the entire game for the rocket launchers. So I highly recommend, outside of Riven and doing the Riven rocket strats, that the rockets don't do enough damage for you to consider. And that's pretty much it. That's the video for you guys today. Hope you guys did enjoy. My name has been Ichronic, and I'll see you guys on the next one.